Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and joining us. We have partnered with the Stoughton Police Department and with Oasis to bring to you tonight Trooper Fanning, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the drug trends that we're seeing in Stoughton and things to be thinking about. And then at the end, we have some people here from the District Court and from the Stoughton Police Department who will introduce themselves, and Oasis is here as well. So if you have questions at the end, they would be some resources for you as well. I'm going to hand it over to Trooper Fanning.
Thanks for coming out tonight. So today, just so you have an understanding of what we did, we had I did two half-hour sessions with the entire high school. So we had all the high school kids in here. The foundation I'm on, no first time. We did the middle school the last 2 years. So they've all kind of heard this program. And then we also did the faculty right after, which was really good. And I'm glad Stoughton's taken an approach of educating everyone because it's a real epidemic. And when I start showing you the numbers, you'll have a good understanding as to why, really every parent in the town should really be here. So it's good that you guys are here. Hopefully some people are watching at home or catch up on this because it's really important. And kind of the mentality with the high school kids today was, with the middle school kids, we're teaching them about decisions that they're going to be making. The mindset I had with the high school kids today is we have to tell them the truth. Some of them are already making these decisions or poor choices. Some of them are going to be faced with these decisions, and it's life or death. We had talked about, so I graduated Stoughton High in '98, and I'll get into a little bit of my history, but we had talked about how really the paradigm's changed here. And I can kind of remember when it changed, but the days of kids partying in the woods with alcohol and some marijuana here and there, those days are over. And I talked to the police officers here. They don't break up parties in the woods. That's just not what's happening. And that changed now probably almost 15 years ago, So I don't know what it would have been like for me if I had to make the decisions that our kids have to make with the drugs that they have. So the big thing for us, and I'll talk about it today, is educating them on, in particular, these prescription pills. The alcohol has always been there. We talk about the alcohol, and then we talk about the marijuana and the dangers of this marijuana and the differences from when you and I were kids as to how it's changed now and how much more dangerous it is, really, because of higher THC content. So let me give you a little bit of my background. I've been a state trooper now for 12 years. I was a Stoughton police officer from 2002 to 2005, and that was I was also in the Marines right after high school. I graduated from Stoughton High in 1998. And I worked with a lot of the police officers that are here, and then I moved on in 2005. My current assignment with the state police is in the homicide unit in Norfolk County. So I cover this county again, and we cover all unattended deaths within the county. So meaning anytime someone dies without a physician present, we come out, investigate, make sure it's not suspicious with the local detectives. And then if it's not suspicious, we provide investigative details to the medical examiner. So I've been doing that for about 5 years. The majority of our work is, generally speaking, high-risk lifestyles, alcoholics, drug addicts, and that goes into the overdoses and the suicides that we deal with, mental health issues, just poor living habits, or high-risk lifestyle behavior choices, obviously. And these are people dying anywhere from their teens all the way till their 50s. So that's the majority of the stuff that we're dealing with. And I'll get into some of the numbers that we're seeing in the county and how bad this has become. And I always remind people, in Norfolk County, we're the top 20 wealthiest county in the country. We're somewhere in the top 20. I've looked it up before, but, so when we talk about drugs only happen in Brockton or these big, large cities, it's not the case. And even here in Stoughton, we've seen a large uptick for a town this size. We have overdose meetings every couple of months in the DA's office. Chief McNamara's attended a bunch of them, and Detective Sergeant Welch. So we're seeing the trends, and Stoughton is trending in a direction for a town of its size that is unusual. And that's why the chief got together with the school and Oasis to kind of put this project together and to kind of educate you guys on some of the stuff we're seeing. And it is scary. So that's kind of my professional career. Also, to give you a little bit about the drug background, my certification just lapsed, but I was a drug recognition expert for the state police, which basically just means if someone's OUI and it's not alcohol and there's drugs, you need specially trained officers to do further testing. So we learned a lot in that. It was myself and Lieutenant Bonney, he's not here today, we went through the same class. And so that will give me some of the information I'm going to pass to you about signs and symptoms and things that you should look for, not just in your own kids, but also your kids' friends and just people that are around your house or around your kids. It's good to know this information. So we'll pass along some of that information. More importantly, when I talk to parents, I get into a little bit about my personal story. So I was born and raised in South Boston in the projects. We moved here to Stoughton in about 4th grade, and I attended the West School and moved through the school system here. Actually, let me go to my next slide. Okay, so that's a much younger picture than me, so I gotta try to find a younger picture for you guys. But that's my sister in the middle, and then my parents. My father died of a drug overdose 7 years ago. Last week would have been his anniversary. It was February 4th. And he died of prescription drug overdose 7 years ago. And then my mother died 3 years ago in January. And although her death wasn't a drug overdose, it was directly related to alcoholism and drug abuse, prescription drug abuse, later on in life. And she passed away at 52. And it was a cigarette, a pill, it didn't matter. The lifestyle she was living was a high-risk lifestyle, and I found my mother overdosed many times later on in life after I had started my own family. So I grew up around drug addicts and alcoholics, and my entire family, all the way through, was this way, and this is how I was brought up. So I always like to talk to parents, and I talked to the teachers today, which was great because the Stoughton teachers, the coaches, the guidance counselors were instrumental in, providing me help. Even though I didn't see it at the time, I saw it much later in life. Just being there and guiding me. And for parents in particular, your kids may have friends who are like me, and I talk to the kids about it too. Like, there's kids sitting there that are just like me, and surviving. That's what it was. It was survival for me. And my friends' parents saved my butt, and I thank them to this day. When I see them, I thank them, and I sit down and say, you let me stay over your house, or give me a ride to hockey, or give me a ride to baseball, was huge. And it really took a whole community for myself to survive, for me to kind of get out of that. And then later on, the Marines kind of kicked me into the next gear. So, I was certainly an at-risk youth, clearly. The percentages were very low that I was going to make it out of that. I think for parents, it's good to know that you need to talk to your kids if you have alcoholism or drug addiction in your family. They are at a higher risk, a genetic disposition to be addicts and alcoholics. That's just a fact. If your kids have mental health issues that they're dealing with, they're at a higher risk for alcoholism and drug addiction. And the reason being is self-medication. Self-medication. So it's a little bit different between the two. Whereas I really had not much supervision, grew up in an environment where drug addiction, alcohol, it was different for me. My parents were great people. I wasn't exposed to drugs. I mean, in all my years, I never saw drugs, ever. But I knew that my parents were high or drunk. Some kids are living it where it's right in front of them all the time. So I think it's just important that you look out for one another, and we talk to the kids about that, taking care of each other, and that these kids can make it in the situation that I was in. So I always bring that up, and I think it's important. So with the kids, I adapted the slides. So with you today, we'll talk a little bit about the signs and symptoms, the trends with the drugs that we're seeing right now, and some of the dangers that are happening here. One of the big things is OUI alcohol and OUI drugs. The number one killer for kids 15 to 24 is still alcohol-related deaths. And by that, I mean the number one cause of death for 15 to 25-year-olds is motor vehicle crashes. 56% of those crashes are alcohol-related. So more than half of these kids that are dying at that age have alcohol involved in the crashes. And that's been a problem since we were kids. It's just getting worse, and it's getting worse because of prescription medicines, marijuana, texting, no seatbelts. It's all the same stuff it's just compounding now as to all the distractions that they have. So that is still the number one cause of death, and it's the leading factor in homicides, suicides, motor vehicle crashes. Alcohol is still number one. The difference is now we're seeing kids that are getting involved with drugs. And let me talk a little bit about the prescription drugs. So you may have kids who are taking legitimate prescriptions for depression or anxiety. So antidepressants, anti-anxiety medicines, ADD, ADHD. And, you know, it's good if they're on these medications. One of the recovering addicts that I speak with, Kevin Rosario, he talks about how he had severe ADD as a kid. He was off the wall, crazy, you know, kind of that crazy kid. And he remembers going to the doctor with his mother, and his mother said, no, my kid's not taking any medicines. And he said, little did she know, 15 years later, I'd be injecting heroin into my arm because of the self-medication. And that's a personal decision. I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but it's something you have to monitor, because when they take a drink of alcohol, which is a depressant, it's calming them down. It's calming the anxiety, the depression, and that self-medication leads to more and more usage, because that's how the drugs work, where we have more and more. They have to take more and more of that substance, and it just continues up the spectrum. So we see a major rise in OUI drugs and alcohol within the state. And with marijuana being legalized now, we're going to see more. There's not great data on marijuana because it's just never really been measured. And a lot of states, including here in Massachusetts, we don't require a blood test after someone is fatally killed in a car crash. If the person's dead, we'll get those results. But if there's a criminal case, I mean, there are some cases where we do get those blood results, but that's not always the case. So we just don't have good data sets on what the impact of marijuana on impaired driving, but it does impair your driving. So I just put up a slide here, and I talked to the kids about this, some of the decisions that they make: driving, seatbelts, alcohol, marijuana. And this was prescription meds and alcohol. To finish up on the prescription medicines, if a kid is on anti-anxiety, antidepressants, amphetamine salts, or Adderall for these conditions, when they add in alcohol or any other type of substance, alcohol, another illegal pill that they're taking illegally, marijuana, it's changing the dynamic of that drug in the system, and they're getting an additive effect. So let's say we're taking an anti-anxiety medication. You add alcohol to that. Those are both classified as depressants. So you're getting an enhanced effect. So if you just had one alcoholic drink, maybe it's not a problem. But if you had one alcoholic drink and you're taking lithium or Prozac or some form of antidepressant, and it warns you on the label, you're going to have a problem with operating a vehicle. And so that's one of the things that we see is people combining mostly alcohol, but the majority of the evaluations I did as a drug recognition expert, the person didn't just have one drug on board. They had multiple drugs, 2 to 3, almost always. We talk a little bit about seatbelts when we're talking to the kids. And I'm sure parents are pushing seatbelts. But I talk about the seatbelts because when I got on the state police, actually even when I got on Stoughton police, I went to crashes where I saw it didn't seem that bad, and the person didn't have their seatbelt out, and they were ejected out of the vehicle. Or I went to other crashes where people were rolled down embankments and into trees, and they had their seatbelt on, and they're just standing there looking at me. The seatbelt is, if you see some of the stuff that we've seen, that seatbelt goes on instantly. So I'm sure you guys are pushing that as parents, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but we do talk to the kids about the seatbelt safety just a little bit, and overall about decision making. So let's talk about opiates, which is really what's kind of brought this to a new paradigm within cities and towns across the state. So it's not just here in Stoughton, but it's everywhere. So how did opiate abuse start? How did we get to where we are? statistically speaking, or the time that law enforcement classifies it, is about 2005 to 2010. We call it the pill epidemic. It probably started before that, maybe 02 or 03. And I remember that from kids that graduated, they were freshmen when I was a senior, and then they grew up and I was dealing with them in law enforcement. Pills started to come big into the scene, and kids were getting away from drinking and marijuana, and they were doing pills. The problem with the pills is this. One, they can get them from your cabinets, and that's where they're getting them. Situate, this affluent town on the South Shore, had a huge pill epidemic. Why did they have a pill problem? They can get them from their cabinets, and they have the resources to buy the pills illegally. You need to monitor your prescriptions. You need to talk to your kids about prescription pills. Why? Kids weren't educated on the fact that all of these drugs are essentially the same when we classify opiates. So we have the opium plant where all this is derived from, and when they first came up with opiate-based drugs, they had morphine. Heroin was an offshoot of it, but for medicinal purposes, we had morphine and then all these other ones. Oxycodone, hydrocodone. Oxycodone is Percocet and what used to be known as Oxycontin. Hydrocodone, which is known as Vicodin, which was the most widely abused prescription for many, many years because it was a Schedule III drug, and the government finally moved it to a regulated class. So these kids were taking these drugs not knowing that these are opium-based drugs. So we don't know when a kid, if he takes 1, if he takes 5, over a period of time he takes 10 or 15 or 20, when that happens in the brain. If you could tell us that would be great information, but we don't know. So when does it happen that someone gets a physical addiction? Well, they generally know because withdrawals start happening. And the first time it happens with pills, they might think, okay, I feel, I have anxiety, I'm not feeling right, I'm shaking. Well, these are now, their body is dependent on these pills. And like I tell the kids, no one, and if you see the stat there, 4 out of 5 heroin users started with prescription pills. So I tell the kids, no one wakes up saying, I want to be a heroin user. I'm going to snort, smoke, or inject heroin into my body someday. No one. Well, there's a few, but generally speaking, large numbers, no one thought that they were going to be there. So the kid that gets addicted then graduates to not just 1 a day, but 2 a day, 3, 4, 5. I've heard upwards of 20 pills a day. This is when we saw a huge uptick in law enforcement and bank robberies, right? Because kids were so sick that they decided robbing banks was the best way to get money to then go buy prescription pills. And for years, in that 05 to 10 era, we had massive, and we still have them, but back then, massive amounts of bank robberies, and kids were just trying to get the pill. And back then we had Oxycontin, which was 20, 40, 60, 80, 120. I think it even went to 160. These are cancer medications. They're supposed to be time-released. So think about it. The most popular pill we have now is a Percocet 30 milligram. That's 30 milligrams of oxycodone. If I give that to anyone here that doesn't take opiates for pain management, you're probably going to violently get sick and potentially overdose. Kids were taking 120 milligrams and chewing them, defeating the time release, and getting all of that oxycodone at one time. So eventually they go to their drug dealer, and the drug dealer says, I have a cheaper product. It's more effective. And there's a stigma to heroin. Back then especially, because people still were like, no, I'm going to stick with the pills. I'm just going to steal from my parents and do whatever I got to do to get the pills. In recent years, in law enforcement and public health, we started cracking down, and also through the doctors and the pharmacies, we started cracking down on prescriptions, including the pharmaceutical companies. So as we pulled the pills away, I think in a sense, and this is my opinion, I don't think there's a study on it, those users were kind of forced into graduating into heroin. And heroin isn't heroin now, it's fentanyl. We're going to talk a little bit about fentanyl too. So this is kind of that progression that's happened and why we find ourselves where we are today. The good and bad news about the pill epidemic is this. The group, that pill epidemic from 2005 to 2010, isn't getting any larger. So we are starting to crack down on pill usage. But those people in the 2005, in that pill epidemic, are dying and getting sick at a ferocious pace everywhere. And this was a study that Boston PD had done through their hospitals to kind of look at what was going on. So these people are getting sick and dying very, very rapidly. And that's why we've seen, and you'll see the numbers on the next slide, of how our numbers are increasing yearly, and it's unbelievable. And hopefully that number starts to come down over the next couple of years from early education, the governor doing what he's doing, and kind of cracking down on these things. But that's the progression. That's what's happened. That's why we find ourselves where we are today. And there's kids that are still doing this stuff. So the pills are still available. So again, it's one of the most widely abused prescription drugs. It's the most deadly. I always like to throw out this stat. We use 75% of the world's opiates in the United States. So the rest of the world has 25%. We have 75%. So clearly there's a problem. So let's look at some of the stats and why we are where we are. So we always hear about fatal gun violence. We hear about fatal car crashes up on 24. You combine the two, and it doesn't touch our fatal overdose number statewide. It's not even close. 5 people a day are dying. That was in 2015, and that continues in 2016, and we're still trending that way in 2017. So 5 people died today, 5 people died yesterday, 5 people will die tomorrow for 365. And that number's probably underreported. It's underreported. It could be 6, it could be 7, but we don't catch up on those numbers till a little bit later. If we look at the stats here in Norfolk County, just look at those numbers. We went from 63 to 93, 151, and that 151 number ended up around 164, 165 after we looked at everything. Our total number in 2016 was 166, and that will probably end up around 180. So you see that these numbers have continued to increase here in the county. How about the numbers here, Chief? Do you know the numbers here?
We had 60 overdose overall
In 2016. So 60 overdoses. Any idea how many were fatal?
12.
So 60 overdoses here in Stoughton, 12 of them were fatal, and the rest were saves. And we'll talk a little bit about Narcan too. And then we have Plymouth County has Brockton, a large city. Our largest cities here in Norfolk County are obviously Quincy and Weymouth, but Brockton holds a large number, and Quincy has a pretty large epidemic as well. So these are our numbers, and they're not getting any better. They haven't got better in 2015, 2016, and we're pretty much on the same pace in 2017. We're going to an overdose every other day in my office. So if someone didn't go to one today, someone will go to one tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So these stats are pretty much the same. So let's talk a little bit about fentanyl and what's kind of happened with fentanyl and some of the scary things that are happening with this now. So as I had said, heroin is a derivative of opium, right? So, or cocaine is a derivative from a plant as well, right? So we're still, if you're a drug dealer, you're still waiting on a harvest every year, whether it's South America, Afghanistan, all across in these warm climates. They're still waiting on a harvest to create all these drugs, right? Fentanyl, which was designed as a tranquilizer for animals or for pain management in animals, is manufactured. It's what we call a synthetic opiate, meaning it's just made in a laboratory. And the process isn't that difficult. So these processes of making fentanyl are so much easier, and now we're not waiting on a harvest, so we can have warehouses in South America. There was a time where these warehouses were into manufacturing marijuana, right? Now that marijuana has been legalized in 3 or 4, well, actually more than that now, but a bunch of different states in the United States, the stuff can be manufactured legally. So they've started to make fentanyl, and the process is not very difficult. It's not cooking. When we talk about methamphetamine, which we don't see much around here, thank God, to make 1 pound of methamphetamine, you make 10 pounds of toxic waste. It's not that way with fentanyl. So what's happened? For a while, they were bringing up heroin and fentanyl. The drug dealers would get maybe a little bit of both. The fentanyl's much, much cheaper. They'd mix it, they would use their normal additives, and they would make more and more drugs at a cheaper cost. Well, then the fentanyl's become so readily available that, and it wasn't illegal for a period of time even, where we didn't have it it is now in Massachusetts, but the laws still aren't that strong on it. Now, why even have heroin at all? Why not just go to fentanyl? We don't have to wait on a harvest. It's much cheaper, 100 times more potent. So, I hardly ever see heroin. So that top right one's a good picture. It still looks like this. It's usually twist-off baggies. Sometimes you'll see it folded in paper. We don't see that too much around here in Eastern Mass. Do you see much of that, Bob? No? Twice, yeah. So out in Western Mass, they see it more. We don't see it much here, but it's usually in a twist-off baggie. It was a tannish substance. I have not seen a tannish substance in quite some time. How about you? No? It's a white powder, and it's a white powder because it's fentanyl. And so all of our overdoses right now are fentanyl. It's not heroin, but it is an opiate. It's a synthetic opiate. It has the same effects, except much, much, much more potent. So one of the other things that they're doing, and this was something that happened here in Stoughton recently with a 17-year-old who overdosed, is they're pressing the fentanyl into Percocet 30 milligrams. So what happens is they press down with presses, make it blue with the imprints, and they pass it off as a Percocet 30 milligram. This is extremely dangerous because it's dangerous enough that you're taking a 30 milligram Percocet, but if now you're getting 30 milligrams of fentanyl as opposed to oxycodone, that's a deadly, deadly mix. And it may have been at least part of the cause as to why that kid had died, is the fact that it was fentanyl and not oxycodone. And we're seeing that more and more and more. And the only reason why it's happening is the drug dealers can produce it cheaper and sell it at the same cost and make more money. And that's what drives this. It's just a typical business model of supply and demand. So this is what a Percocet 30 milligram looks like. And you can go on and look at all different types of, they have, and I'm sure you've seen some of them if you've had a tooth pulled or had a surgery. They had 5 milligram Percocets, 10 milligram oxycodone. And again, when we talk about that, that's all the oxycodone, and it's all within the opium class of drugs. So this is what a Percocet 30 milligram looks like, and they're now pressing fentanyl to look exactly like that, which is obviously extremely deadly. We're even seeing it in cocaine now, which is mind-blowing to me because cocaine is a stimulant. 10,000 cups of coffee, as a stimulant, and they're putting fentanyl in it, which has the totally opposite effect of cocaine. So someone who's using cocaine is now getting fentanyl, and it's deadly. Okay, let's talk about alcohol and depressants. I'm not going to get too much into alcohol. Again, I already told you it's still the leading cause of death. They're the big thing, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things you can talk to your kids about, and I think the science is good. I could print off stats from all types of different websites. I did some research last night, and the stats, they're good, they vary. I think if you're going to talk to your kids about it, it'd be better if you went and did your own research, and we'll talk about some things. But the important thing is, actually, I'm not going to talk about it just yet because we're going to talk about it in a minute, but what we should talk to our kids about when it comes to alcohol and depressants. So I talked to a little bit about depressants, and we talked about anti-anxiety medications, and one of the trends we're seeing here in Stoughton is the use of Xanax. So Xanax is an anti-anxiety medication. It's classified as a depressant, as I had said, and within this family we have Klonopin, Ativan, Xanax, clonazepam, lorazepam, and basically this stuff is just, you take one and you can imagine if you're in a panic attack or an anxiety attack, it calms you right down. An atomic bomb could be going off and you're sitting there with a smile on your face because nothing really cares in the world. If you have anxiety, it's certainly a good medication. If you don't, you're getting you're taking it for an effect, and that effect is to be zoned out to the world. The one thing about depressants, and when I heard that kids were using Xanax, we typically see the Xanax with the opiates. It's common that we see them hand in hand. It's a deadly combination because we're adding a narcotic analgesic, an opiate, which depresses the respiratory system, the pulse, and then we take a depressant, which does the same thing. And back when the pill epidemic was huge, we were seeing a lot of pill overdoses with kids that were taking Oxycontin and Xanax. So this is what they look like. The top one is a 2 milligram bar, they call it. And that's what it looks like. Then we have a quarter milligram, 1 milligram, and a half milligram in the bottom left. And these pills can look like everything. If you find pills in your home, go on drugs.com, type in the imprint, and you'll know what you have. But you can see how difficult it is with the pills. And when I was talking to the teachers here today, you really need to look for the signs and symptoms. And that's what's, actually, I'm glad I brought that up because I didn't tell you the signs and symptoms. Can you tell me when we're running out of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have about 20 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the signs and symptoms, because when we talk about these things, you're thinking, well, John, I'm never going to see my kid put a pill in his mouth or any of these things, right? They're going to hide it from you, and that's why hidden in plain sight's good. When I'm on the foundation I'm on, the Greens, they lost their son in Easton. John Green's from Stoughton. They moved to Easton, and their 19-year-old son did the exact same progression I just told you about. At 15, he took a pill. That progressed. By 17, he was injecting heroin. By 19, he was dead. And that was the progression. And that's a very normal progression that we see. And what they always talk about is when they saw this, or when they found out that he was using pills, they needed to call in the Army. They needed to get the resources. People through OASIS, local police, educators. And I'm not speaking out of school, they admit fully well they were not educated. And when their kids started using pills, they should have took direct action, put him in a detox, put him in a rehab. And no one wants to do that, but 2 years later when he's injecting heroin, they will tell you it was a whole different animal. You're in a whole different animal. Because addicts, and I grew up around them, and it boggled my mind for many years. But I think over the last few years, I've kind of understood how an addict, when they start the drug, it's for fun, peer pressure, they think they're having a good time with their friends. But when they get addicted, it's now when they stop, they feel so sick, so deathly ill that they fear that they're going to die if they don't get the next dosage. And they know full well that that next dosage could kill them. But the overriding fear is that if they don't get it, they're going to die. And it seems counterintuitive, but that's what's happening with these kids. So, with opiates, very simple. Lethargic behavior, something that we call being on the nod. So someone would start nodding off. But you could ask them a question. So someone would be nodding off, and then you'd say, John, and they pick their head up. Yes. Nodding off is a big telltale sign. Now, when someone who's addicted, and hopefully you pick up on these signs well before this, when someone's addicted, when they initially take the opiate, they get kind of a surge of energy, and they act kind of crazy. And then what happens is the drug takes effect, as it should, and they become more lethargic, on the nod. And the telltale sign is pinpoint pupils. So by pinpoint pupils, I mean the black part of your eye gets as small as a pin. If you looked into the sun, or if I looked directly into a light right here, my pupils would go right down into pins. It's the only time that my eyes should be constricted. In a normal setting like this, your pupils are, nice round circles. If we're in a dark room, your pupils get bigger to try to adjust for the lack of light. And when you look into the sun, your eye goes into a protective mode, and they become pins. Telltale sign, and again, in law enforcement, we can't just go off one single indicator. I would say to you, look around with other behaviors, and if you're seeing pinpoint pupils, you have a problem. You have a problem. Pinpoint pupils, lethargic behavior, lowered pulse, lower breathing, relaxed state, relaxed muscles. That's kind of the general observations that you're going to see with someone on an opiate. Scratching, if someone's scratching, anyone who's had a child, and you get the large amounts of opiates when you're doing that, you'll see I remember my wife, I have 5 kids, so I remember it pretty vividly. She would get the vicious itching, and they usually give you a medication to offset that, but that's the opiates acting in the body where someone's scratching. Scratching is another telltale sign, which I actually forgot today, but that's a really telltale sign, is the scratching. With depressants, pills, anti-anxiety, antidepressants, it's the same as alcohol. It's the same as alcohol, except without the alcoholic odor. Again, depressed, relaxed, lethargic speaking, All of those things are things that you're going to see with someone who's on depressants. So just think about alcohol when we talk about Xanax, Klonopin, and those types of drugs. So those are the signs and symptoms for the two. You know alcohol, and we'll talk a little bit about marijuana in a second here. No, we'll talk about it now. So here's the thing about marijuana. I felt like in past years we just talked about how we've kind of sent the wrong message to our kids about marijuana because we voted in medicinally, and now we voted it in to legalize it. And the bottom line is marijuana has always been available medicinally. There are medicinal purposes that work with marijuana. There's 28 organic compounds in marijuana. Each of them, to work properly, needs the activation of THC, which is the actual component of the drug that gets you the high. It's still a dangerous drug. And one of the big dangers that we see now is the potency is much higher. So if we go back to Woodstock days or earlier, the hippie days, that marijuana, 10% THC, maybe. And now we're seeing 15, 20, 25% THC. We talk about edibles and we talk about the hash oil. We're talking upwards of 50 to 90% of THC. Those are deadly dosages. One of the things that marijuana does is it dilates. So when someone's, and I'll talk a little bit about signs and symptoms. When someone's taking marijuana, their pupils generally get larger. So it would look like they're in a dark room. And it's pretty easy to pick off because if you're in normal lighting conditions and you see all black in their eye, that's generally speaking, not always, some people just have bigger pupils, a sign of potentially marijuana usage. Another thing you'll see is eyelid tremors. So if their eyes are closed, you can see their eyelids tremor back and forth. You'll see body tremors even sometimes. One thing you can also do is you can look at their tongue, and if you see a white or a greenish film on their tongue, that can also be an indicator. So not just one of these things is important by itself, but if you start putting all these things together with behavioral changes, and that was one thing that the Greens talked about, is their son was super active, always out, always doing things, and then all of a sudden he came home with a girl and he was in his room for weeks, months at a time. That's a behavioral change, and when we talk about hidden in plain sight, it's your house. Rip through their room, look at the things that we have in there, and find out what the heck's going on, and really because it's life or death. So with the marijuana at the younger age, they're double the risk of depression later in life, lower IQ, brain development, and when we talk about things you can talk to your kids about, the science of this is really important. One thing that helped save me growing up in the environment I did is I was deathly afraid of drugs. I thought if I did a drug, I was going to die. That probably saved me from getting into these types of things. I don't know how you passed that on. That was just something in me. DARE actually helped a lot with that. I was like, I'm going to die. I'm not touching that. But you know, when alcohol gets involved, you know, it can lower your inhibitions and you do things you might not normally do as well. So again, impaired emotional development, risk of being dissatisfied with life, likely to suffer depression, anxiety, psychosis. So now we talk about, this is what normal marijuana generally looks like, although it looks a lot different now. It's made in laboratories. It's not made like it used to be out in a field. And then that's an edible on the right. Would anyone know that that's a marijuana edible? Not me. So the thing about the marijuana edibles as well, we talked about earlier, is, you know, a person might be given a dosage of, okay, you take a bite or a square of that for 10 milligrams. They're ingesting the entire thing. So now we're getting a much higher THC content when we talk about edibles, and I'll show you some more here. Gummy bears, those are edibles. And then look at that, it looks like the 7-Eleven shop. 2 for $3. And that's and these are edibles here as well. So again, how are you going to tell the difference, right, as parents? Again, it's those behavioral changes, some of the signs and symptoms we told you about. These are the things that you want to be looking for. And then these are the other things that we're talking about with the hash oil. So this isn't something that's being made by, this is not a legal substance. It's not supposed to be being made. But what this is they basically cook down with high heat the actual green leafy substance, and they get the oil from it, and then they make these things into, I don't know, it would almost be like if you laid out honey and let it freeze, and then you broke off broke off the honey. That's what this kind of looks like. So they call it honeycomb, shatter, solvent hash, butter, crumble. And all it is it's hash oil, which is much, much more potent. And you see up there 50 to 90% THC. And those dosages can become deadly. We haven't seen it, no. It would be very rare to see a drug. I've never seen one, and I don't think nationally we've seen a marijuana overdose. But I suspect in the coming years we're going to see more of them because of these higher THC contents. All right, so what's most important now that I've scared everyone half to death? First off, hopefully this isn't your kids. Like I said, I have 5 kids. They're younger. My oldest is 9. And I've already started to think about, how we're going to do this. And one benefit of speaking on a foundation is I've kind of learned some ways that I think will hopefully be effective. Again, my kids are at a genetic disposition to be at a higher risk to be drug addicts and alcoholics. So I have to be extremely vigilant about, what types of things that we're talking about. And I think the big things are common sense. One, they're watching us and they're emulating us. And I'm preaching to the choir on this, but we have to think about, what we're doing at home and the example we're setting for them. In particular, when we're talking about this reward-based system, if they see a celebration and they associate, everyone in the family drinking, that's what they're going to associate later as they get older or when they go to a party in high school. These types of associations with party, fun equals lots of alcohol, right? So, and I just bring these things up. It's something to think about. You can go on websites. There's tons of websites on things you can do, but I'll give you a few pointers as to what we've learned over the years. The single largest thing that you can do to prevent your kid from being a drug addict or an alcoholic is talking to them about it. Number one, if you talk to them about the dangers of drug use and alcohol use, that lowers your chances by 20% is the statistic I read last night. 20%. It might even be higher. So just talking to them about these risks, and we can give all kinds of examples, but you each know your kids better than anyone else. So you have to determine, is your kid the type that is going to rebel against everything you say? Is your kid the type that's going to listen to you? Is your kid the type that's would like a science, factual-based thing? And when I talk about that, it's the stats are, if you don't drink alcohol till you're 18, it lowers your chances of being an addict by 30%. If you don't drink alcohol till you're 21, it lowers your chances of being an alcoholic by 60%. So pull up those numbers if that's what your kid needs and use them. One of the things I do with my kids, they're young. If I have a glass of wine or a drink in the house and they ask me about it, it's a poison, which it is. Alcohol is a poison, essentially, that we're putting into our body for an effect. I say, you can make that decision when you're 21, when your brain's fully developed. And a lot of these things is about the development of the brain. It's not fully developed until they're 21. So I think if they're those type of kids that like a science or a factual type thing, those are the things that you want to look into. I think another good thing is to talk about other kids. Maybe talk about some things that have happened locally. You can go in the paper and find out things. Like I said, just recently in town, a 17-year-old passed away. You can talk about it and say, if you see your friends doing this, maybe you should tell them some of these things and have some stats and some things ready for them. So where if you have that rebellious kid where you're saying, no, don't do this, don't do that, what's going to happen? It was the same thing that we did. Say, yeah, whatever, Dad, whatever, Mom, I'm not doing that. So instead, use it as, hey, if your friends are doing this, or I just heard about this kid doing this. It has to be an open dialogue, and it has to be continuous. And just by the mere fact of you guys being here, I know that you're being proactive in your kids' lives, so that's important. So again, science, brain, be realistic and honest, especially when it comes to, I don't know, when you grew up, well, my family was different, but a lot of families, especially the Irish families, would not talk about Uncle Jimmy. Everyone knew Uncle Jimmy was an alcoholic, but no one wanted to talk about Uncle Jimmy being an alcoholic. Talk about Uncle Jimmy. You're predisposed genetically, just like cancer, to be an alcoholic. You need to talk about those things. And again, setting the example, and then higher risk. And it's the same with the marijuana. It's a legal substance now. So again, find some things that you want to talk to about the science behind marijuana. I've got a huge uptick of good kids, who are smoking marijuana as opposed to drinking alcohol. And this is kind of the new trend. One kid I talked to in Braintree, his parents, they were a family friend. Kid's brilliant. He's at George Washington right now. He's a chronic marijuana smoker. This kid speaks Arabic. He probably would have been great in the CIA or FBI, which was kind of his direction at BC High. He will never be in the CIA or FBI as a chronic marijuana smoker. So if your kids have goals that you know about, anything, I mean, doctor, I mean, what profession is going to allow someone to be chronically smoking marijuana and think it's okay because it's not alcohol? So again, bring these things up to them, and those are important things to talk about. This is Narcan. So what does Narcan do? Narcan immediately blocks the receptors of opiate-based drugs. Fentanyl, heroin, oxycodone. Instantly reverses the effects. When I first came on Stoughton PD, I remember the first overdose I went to. Back then, the paramedics gave it intravenously, I'm pretty sure. And they said, hey, back up. I'm like, oh, what do you mean? This kid's going to flip out, and boom, they hit him with the injection, and he hopped up like a zombie, and he was pissed because his high was instantly gone. And as I told you before, an addict only cares about their withdrawals. It's their withdrawals. Trust me when I tell you, my parents were great people. It's an alien in the body, and you'll never, if you try to wrap your head around it, you're going to die trying to wrap your head around it. It's very frustrating. I don't know what else to say about dealing with an addict, but Narcan instantly reverses. We don't know where a person is along the stage of really dying or overdosing. Maybe someone just took the drug and they're in the initial stages of it, and the Narcan works instantly. Maybe it doesn't, and it takes, what's the most you guys have ever done at a single dose? How many sprays or doses? 4, and the person came back? 4 doses of Narcan, and the person came back. Again, we don't know, and you could use it 4 times and the person doesn't come back. Again, the breathing stops, then the heart stops, and there's no reversing those effects. So with the Narcan, we see a lot of cases where a person's been hit with Narcan 3 or 4 times and been saved, and then we come to a fatal overdose. Again, it's frustrating, but there's times when someone is given this drug, it saves their life, and they become recovering addicts and regain their lives. So we can't really put a measure on saving someone's life. We are saving someone's life. Even if they die down the road, there's still that opportunity that this person's going to change their life because of this episode. So it's important. Don't be afraid of Narcan. It's really, it's not a dangerous drug otherwise. If someone got it normally, it wouldn't have any effect on them. So, this isn't like a dangerous drug, Narcan. It's a life-saving drug. And so don't be afraid of Narcan, in particular if you're living with an addict. So this was Evan, who I talked about earlier. I just end the slide with this. Again, Evan was 19 years old when he died, and the Greens started the foundation that I'm on. And from an early education perspective, it's going well. It's going well. So that's all I have. I think we got some time for some questions. Yeah, so you can either ask questions now, but there's a small enough group that I'll be here anyways. And then hidden in plain sight, if you haven't been down there, you can go back down there and kind of tear into some things. But if you have any questions now, I'll take them, and everyone else can be educated by your question.
Do you have any information you can give us on steroids?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. One thing I think is interesting about steroids, and we talked about this earlier, and I talked about it tonight. When I looked at, when I left high school, there was an age group below us that had kind of got into steroid usage a little bit. And I just heard that through the grapevine, because steroid usage is no one talks about it, right? Because the people that are using it want to think, well, I got massive like this because I just work out and eat a lot of chicken. But that's not the case. But what I think is interesting about the steroid usage is if someone's willing to take a pill for an effect or to inject for an effect, they're going to be just that more likely to now take another pill for an effect. And we saw that with a large group of kids who I ended up dealing with later who were hooked on the pills, meaning the opiate-based drugs. So I'm not saying there's a direct correlation between it. This is just my opinion of things that I saw over my years and I just dealt with actually another steroid guy in a homicide that I'm doing. That lifestyle can just lead to more and more drug usage, I think. Not always, because a lot of these people that are taking steroids are health and their fitness, and that's what they're pushing for. But the signs and symptoms with the steroids are obviously going to be getting bigger, unusually fast, which really shouldn't be happening even in puberty, but getting larger very quickly, acne, changes of temperament very quickly where they snap very quickly. They're walking around with a lot of water. Now, again, don't take this, your kid's walking around with a jug of water, they just want to hydrate. But if you're seeing all these things, and now they're walking around with water because if they're taking the pill dosage of steroids, it's taxing on the kidneys and liver. So they drink a lot of water to kind of flush through the kidneys and liver. Again, it's more of a behavioral thing, size, acne, not just puberty type things, but like acne, size, behavioral changes, and all those things combined. There are long-term effects of steroids, but again, I don't think I've ever seen an overdose from steroids, but there's just certainly long-term effects of steroids, cancer, heart problems, brain function, testicular issues. So those are kind of the things that you'd see with the steroids. All right, well, I'll be here for a bit, and you can come up and talk to me if you want. Thanks for listening, and thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.